EU leaders now preparing sanctions on entire sectors of the Russian economy. The official announcement coming from Brussels this Tuesday. They go from everything from energy to armament. So far, economic interests have mostly trumped all other considerations when it comes to sanctions. Look no further than the 1.1 billion euro French contract to supply the Kremlin with 2 state-of-the-art Mistral warships. Now, back in March, when Vladimir Putin became the first European leader to grab land on the continent since World War II, the response was relatively muted. Now, after a proxy civil war and the downing of a passenger plane loaded with EU citizens, Europeans have decided to act. Will sanctions force Putin to raise the white flag or dig in his heels? And what's Europe's plan for preventing a new Cold War? Today in the France24 debate, Europe's plan for Putin. With us from the town of Dickfeitsen in Germany, Rebecca Harms, co-chair of the Greens voting bloc in the European Parliament. Many thanks for being with us.
Hello.
We also welcome to the show. He teaches at the American Graduate School, former German diplomat Wilfried Borlewski. Welcome back. Welcome back to Edouard Tetreau, who runs the Paris bureau of the European Council on Foreign Relations.
Hello.
And joining us, Chief Foreign Editor Robert Parsons, the France24 debate, where you can join the conversation on Facebook and on Twitter, our hashtag F24Debate. Now, before we talk about the decisions made in Brussels, let's talk about what's going on inside of Ukraine. Yet more fighting in the east of the country, shells falling inside the increasingly besieged separatist-held city of Donetsk, several dozen killed elsewhere in the east. Let's go to Ukraine. And France24's Luke Brown, who joins us from the town of Dnipropetrovsk. Luke, tell us, at this particular point in time, what is the state of play when it comes to all this fighting?
Well, it's been a significant increase in the violence and in the death toll over the past 24 hours in eastern Ukraine. First up in Holivka, 17 civilians reportedly killed. That, according to the local authorities allied to the separatists, can't necessarily be independently confirmed, but they do indicate that those 17 civilians were killed when missiles fell on residential areas. Now, Holivka is important strategically, as it does rather control the access northwards of Donetsk itself. That explains the ferocity of the fighting there over the past 3 or 4 days. Further to the east in Lugansk, at least 5 civilians killed there in an attack on Tuesday, my apologies. That, according again to the local separatist authorities, according to them, they say those 5 fatalities were in an old people's home, again struck by those unguided missiles. One of the big significant developments over the past few hours has been then the fighting also reaching the center of the city of Donetsk, the regional capital of the region of Donetsk. Up until now, it has been on the periphery. On Tuesday, a number of loud explosions were heard in central downtown Donetsk. At least 1 civilian fatality there reported. Again, it would appear to be the victim of those unguided Grad missile attacks. The significance of that does seem to indicate that the Ukrainian government forces really are stepping up their offensive. Their strategy is pretty clear. They are really encircling the separatist strongholds and dotted around the east of the country. Really, it would seem to be trying to cut off their supply routes, their alleged supply routes with Russia. The impact of that, too, is being felt on the international investigation into the tragedy and the downing of flight MH17 for the 3rd straight day on Tuesday. The international investigators and the OSCE monitors had to turn back, failing to reach the crash site, gain access to the crash site because of the fighting once again. The impact are going to be pretty clearly felt there. They're not going to be able to reach the crash site to pick up any evidence that could be found there. Also, it's going to hamper their efforts this 3rd straight day of failing to gain access to the crash site, hamper their efforts to really recuperate and repatriate the human remains that are still thought to be located there.
Very briefly, Luke, you're saying that it does seem, again, that government forces have the momentum. How do the locals where you are feel about it?
Well, the side of the country I am in is actually government-held, Ukrainian government-held. They're very patriotic, really, here. A lot of Ukrainian government, Ukrainian flags, the blue and yellow flags flying in this city. One of the very large buildings not very far from here has actually been repainted in the colours of the flag. It is a completely different situation here, where normal life continues pretty much as it always has done. People are going shopping as they always have done. Compare that with the situation in Donetsk, which I left on Monday, which is basically seems to be a ghost town over the past 5 days or so. Local residents are fleeing at a pretty regular rate by the routes that they can take, and many of the roads out of Donetsk have been closed off, either by the government offensive or by the separatists themselves. Many of the trains out to having to take lengthy detours to avoid the fighting. That's not really facilitating the flow of people out of Donetsk, but it is still a very clear flow out of Donetsk. As I said, it's a ghost town. Most of the shops are shut. The UN estimating about 100,000 people, not necessarily just from the city of Donetsk, but from the region itself, have been displaced by the fighting.
Luke Brown, many thanks for that live update. And again, Ukrainian government forces have the momentum, but also this Tuesday, Moscow repeating accusations that Kiev's forces had fired across the border into Russian territory, an accusation that's denied. Robert Parsons, could this all turn on a dime if Russia decides to increase the pressure from across the border?
Perhaps. There's no doubt that the Russians feel that the situation is slipping out of control to some degree in eastern Ukraine. The military side of the operation is not going well. The rebels, as Luke just said, are on the defensive. It may be that the Russians are trying to provoke the Ukrainians into taking precipitate action, rather as happened in 2008 with Georgia, when the Russians lured effectively President Saakashvili of Georgia into a trap. It may be that the Russians are trying to sucker the Ukrainians into taking action which they will regret, which will pave the way for what the Russians would call a peacekeeping force in eastern Ukraine. But we're just speculating at the moment. But certainly the feeling, I think, in Moscow is at the moment is that the situation on the ground is slipping out of control.
Rebecca Harms, how do you see Moscow reacting to the military situation in the east?
So I visited the east, the Oblast Kharkiv, and then also two cities in the nearby to Donetsk, Slavyansk and Artyomovsk. And I have the impression that especially since the Ukrainian army is more successful, and even after the catastrophe with the Malaysian airplane, Russia is investing more in arms and also in money to support the militias in Donetsk and Luhansk.
So investing more in terms of money, upping the stakes. So I guess the question begs, and I'll put it to you, Edouard Tetreau, the sanctions, yes. Will they make Moscow pause for thought? Or could there be a repeat of the Georgia scenario where they sort of sucker in Kiev for a fight?
Right. I think it is a defining moment for Europe and the European defense project vis-à-vis these sanctions. And we need to get fully on board our American allies there. The sanctions that are being discussed and probably approved today are in three domains. One is energy, the second is finance, financial services, and the third is military. And clearly we have three capitals that are very concerned by that, which are in order: Berlin, going from east to west, Berlin, Paris, and New York.
London.
And London, Berlin, Paris, London, and New York. Let's start with here, Paris. It is obviously not acceptable today that France will ship two stealth, so almost invisible warships to Russia.
That's what the defense minister said today, that he's in Tokyo. He said, we're still going ahead with it.
Yes, but we at ECFR, the European Council on Foreign Relations, we have a different view and proposition, and it's a very concrete one. Let's come back to this very sensitive issue, and we'll discuss also the City of London. These stealth warships The original project was, okay, we are going to sell them to you because we understand that they will be anchored in Vladivostok, in the Pacific. Now events show us that these warships will actually very likely stay in the Black Sea around Sebastopol. We as Europeans cannot afford this. We cannot let France, a member country, do that. There is a very simple solution. We will not sink these warships. One is already made, the other is on the way to being made. Well, I know of a huge institution that has a 1,000 billion euro budget that it spends every 7 years on a variety of things, and we do not know where exactly the money is going. It is the European Union. And what about the European Union? If the European Union is serious about its defense project, is serious about defending its values, its frontiers, its interests, say, well, look, we are going to buy these 2 ships. We are going to anchor one in the North Sea, maybe in the Channel, around the Belgium, Netherlands, that already have in common some naval infrastructure. We are going to anchor the other one in the Mediterranean. If Europe is serious about its values, its interests, this is what needs to be done. Well, on the other, if I may, because it's a complete package. The British Prime Minister has been very vocal, and for good reasons, on we need to go further on sanctions. So far, our British friends have paid a lot of lip service to sanctions as regards freezing financial assets of Mr. Putin's close circle of friends and oligarchs who have not 1.2 billion, but tens of billions of euros of money invested in the City of London. Those assets need to be frozen today. And it is not paying lip service to that, it is taking action now. And the other, obviously there will be retaliation. When you look at a country like Germany or East European countries, they are overly dependent on Russian gas. There will be an issue with Russian gas. We need our US partners to stand firm on this, to provide their European allies with concrete alternatives. Otherwise, if you only have a number of European nations taking sanctions and the US stepping back, as it did on other front lines,
all right, so there's three different sectors that you're mentioning. Yep. Let's go through them one by the other. First, I'll tell you, there's a lot of viewers reacting. One comment, Putin will not bend. He's never backed off, apologized before. He will continue the war, but maybe change theater. Robert Parsons.
No, I mean, I agree with everything you said, but the problem with what you said is it doesn't address what the European Union is about to do. What we're hearing is that, of course, there will be an arms embargo and an embargo on dual-use technologies, but there's a get-out clause which directly affects the sale of Mistral. In other words, arms deals that have already been concluded will not be part of this sanctions, the new sanctions being introduced or announced tomorrow.
Wilfried Belewski, your thought on the new sanctions that have been announced this Tuesday, and on the idea of how to share the pain if you do implement them on things like defense and banking?
I think the West is maneuvering itself into a dead end with sanctions. Let's look at the character of sanctions, and let's not forget, because due to all the incidents and incidental events, the basic and fundamental issues. Sanction is a coercive denial of equality. It has a punitive character, it's incriminating, and it has a hegemonic touch to it. All of these definitions of sanctions are against what Putin is aiming at. Putin's basic aim is co-equality with the US and with the European Union. And the second aim is the influence on neighboring countries, former Soviet Union countries. Sanctions in itself have rarely succeeded in changing the policy of the present regime. North Korea, Iran, Cuba. Why Ukraine? Because they are a sword which cuts both ways, number one. And number two, the threshold of endurance is higher and larger for Putin than the West is thinking. Mainly because of his ideational identity concerns rather than resource and material concerns.
All right, agreeing with you is one viewer saying Putin does not care about sanctions. Rebecca Harms, do you agree with Wilfried Belewski?
So I see the situation completely different, I fear. So I think there is clearly a need for the European Union to react in a clear way to what is going on in the east of the continent. It started with Crimea. It started with incredibly breaking the Budapest Treaty. So the nuclear disarmament treaty, which has been signed with Ukraine, Russia, UK, and the United States. And it continues now with the destabilization of the Donbas region, which intends to destabilize Ukraine as a very important country in our neighborhood. And I think for the EU, so it's not about sanctions as such. Yeah? It's about sanctions to get impact on what Russia with President Putin's strategy is following right now. So we are still, I think, on our way as Europeans to try to find a solution against the military escalation.
But do you take Wilfried Belewski's
based on sanctions, and those sanctions, even if they have started, from my point of view, very weak, had already impact in Russia on Russian economy. And there is a huge chance that if the Europeans go for an approach in solidarity, covering also the French problems, then this impact can grow.
All right. By the way, we've heard, and you just said that they won't have an impact. We heard Rebecca Harms say they have had an impact. We heard Wilfried Belewski say that. Sorry, we heard Wilfried Belewski say they won't. We heard Rebecca Harms saying they have had an impact. Are the sanctions impacting Russia?
Where I agree with Mr. Belewski is that we do not want the sanctions to make things worse than they are today. So we need to calibrate them and hit the right place. I know of one area where Mr. Putin's Russia is sensitive and will react and will probably stop the mayhem. We saw with Syria that the death toll, the number of casualties, whether you gas civilian population, etc., has no impact at all for Mr. Putin. But if you start to hit at Mr. Putin's close circle of friends and financial interests that are very much liquid and worked in two places, one is the City of London, two is Wall Street banks, then you will see a reaction.
Then you'll see a reaction. I'm going to cut you off. I'm going to cut you off because we have to take a quick break, but we'll be back. Stay with us. You're watching the France24 debate.
Pour moi, France 24, c'est une